the first 18 verses. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went towards the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Yes, indeed. So, the story about Mary Magdalene, a lot of weeping involved, clearly a lot of confusion about what's going on that first Easter morning, right? And that's important because as we've done this journey through Lent and through Holy Week, one of the things we've been talking about is trying to figure out where the destination might be, because it's not really very obvious in the story, and now we know the destination is turns out to be an empty tomb, big thing carved out of rock with the cover rolled away. That's supposed to mean something, right? So I'd like to look at that and think about it. At the very start of the entire narrative, if you pick your Bible up right at the very beginning, here's how the story works. In the beginning, God creates and creates life. And then every conceivable thing that could possibly go wrong goes wrong. One thing after another. You have the story of Adam and Eve. You have the story of Cain and Abel. One brother murders another one. You have the story of the Tower of Babel, people climbing up, trying to get into heaven and be gods themselves. You have the story of Noah's Ark, everything gets obliterated. That's just some of them. There are others as well. So God creates, everything's great. Every conceivable thing that could go wrong does go wrong. And then the rest of the story is about trying to fix it. That's what the Bible is in about 3 sentences, right? That's what it is. And we've seen previously that according to John in his gospel, when Jesus is on the cross, the words, "It is finished." And we looked in great detail at what does that mean? And we concluded that if we translated it properly into English, we would realize that it doesn't mean this is finished as in it's all over and done with, it was a catastrophe, I wish I hadn't bothered. What it means is it, in other words, the putting it all right, is accomplished. It is done. It is brought to fruition. Remember? So that's what this means. The crucifixion story is the fixing of all of those things that went wrong. After many, many, many attempts throughout the story, it all gets fixed right here. No, we're just not told how. We're just told that it is. So the question then is, because Jesus dies on the cross, is that the end of it? Or is God going to reboot everything? Just as at the beginning there was creation, will there now be new creation? Just as at the beginning God gave life, will God now give new life? That question is still floating there at the time of the crucifixion. And the answer to it comes from this, which says, yes, God gives new life, God gives new creation. That's what this means. That's the message of the empty tomb. It's about new life, new creation. But it doesn't make any sense unless you see the rest of the story that goes before it. So what I thought we'd do is just take a very quick look at John's account, the one that I read to you, because there are some strange things in it that we ought to just comment on here. And then we'll try and see what it means as we try and join our lives to this narrative. What does it mean for us? So the story starts on the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene comes to a tomb, sees that it's empty and the stone's been rolled away. So Magdalene is not her last name. It's where she's from. It means it's Mary of Magdala, and Magdala is a place. And she is an exceptionally strange choice to be the key witness of something as extraordinary as this. We will see later in one of the other Gospels. She is the woman from whom 7 demons were cast, which is a way of saying that she was a deeply disturbed, troubled individual whose life had been very painful and very difficult. And she is the one who is chosen to be the principal witness of this event. Well, that's something, isn't it? If you were trying to trick people into thinking that this story was real, who would you pick? Maybe you'd go pick a judge or a police officer or something. You certainly wouldn't go pick somebody from whom 7 demons had been cast. So that's Mary. She goes there and she discovers that the stone's removed from the tomb. So she runs off and tells the male followers of Jesus. She is one of the female followers of Jesus, of which there were many. And so she goes and tells Simon Peter. And then there's this other disciple. It's a little strange. The wording here, you see, it says the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, kind of implying that he wasn't so fond of the rest of them, right? But I think that's not the point of it here. It's a way of saying somebody who you view as your brother, but he's not your biological brother, but you've been best friends forever, and that's your main buddy. That's who this is here. Most people think it was John, but we don't really know. So, what's her first thought when she gets back and she tells the guys what's happening? Her first thought has got nothing to do with resurrection at all. Nothing. She thinks somebody has taken Jesus' body, and she doesn't know where. So, no thoughts of a resurrection whatsoever. She thinks it's either body snatchers or somebody has moved the body for some legitimate reason somewhere else, but she doesn't know where it is, so she's a bit panicked about it and a bit confused about the whole thing. So Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, they rush off to the tomb and they start running in order to get there. And when they get there, there's all this detail about these pieces of cloth that seem like really extraneous information. Why do you need to know that? Well, the reason you need to know that is because funerary linens in the first century were worth a ton of money. They're really, really expensive. If you were to break into a tomb and steal the body, you'd never leave all the linens behind. That's where all the cash is if you're going to sell it, right? You can sell the body to somebody who's maybe doing their version of medical experiments, but the linens are worth a fortune. You certainly don't dump those on the floor and run off. So this is another way of saying in the story, look, it's very unlikely that somebody stole this body. That's what that means, that they're finding all these linens lying around everywhere. And then the empty tomb is witnessed by 2 men. If you come to church here regularly, you will know what that means, right? In first century Jewish law, if an event is witnessed by 2 males, and they tell a story that is identical, corroborates, then that story will be admitted to their equivalent of a court of law, as a matter of fact. If two Jewish men say this happened, and they agree in all the details, then as far as the law courts are concerned, that's a fact. You don't have to establish it anymore. So the fact that there's two men here in the story is another way of saying this is real. This is a fact according to our legal system, that this body is not here in this tomb. That's what it means. So the guys then promptly go home. So is this like a guy thing or something, I think, that whenever the story gets really, really interesting and something really important is going to happen, the guys just all go home and miss it. It happens over and over again throughout the biblical narrative. They go home, they do the first century equivalent of, turning the game on, they're all sitting around, and there's always interesting stuff that's going on over here, and they miss the whole thing. And that's exactly what happens here. They go home, but Mary stays. So Mary of Magdala, she stays, and she's weeping because she doesn't know anything about any resurrections. She thinks somebody's run off with Jesus' body, and she clearly loved this man, and so that's a tragedy for her. But it means she didn't miss what happened next. And what happens next is she has this religious experience that's described as seeing two angels or two messengers sitting where the body of Jesus had been, one at each end here. What does that mean? Well, it means that the hand of God is on this. You have to remember, when these people wrote these stories, they are singularly disinterested in the questions that we're interested in. Like, we might be saying, how is this possible? Can that really happen? Is that real? Things like that. It would never occur to a first century reader to ask those questions. A first century reader would say, what does this mean? And what this means is the hand of God is right there, right? God has sent God's own angels to be there. That's what it means. God is present in this story. So, and then they say to her, why are you weeping? Because it doesn't make any sense to them why she's weeping, because they know what's happened to Jesus, but she doesn't. So she's weeping, a lot of confusion. She says, they've taken him away. I don't know where they put him. She continues to think that body snatchers or something has come in and taken Jesus' body away. So that's really horrible for her. And then she turns around, and Jesus is standing there. And it says, but she did not know that it was Jesus. One might wonder why not, given that they know each other incredibly well. Now, she has been sobbing and weeping, so there's that. She turns around. But so ask if it was you. Just imagine you're there in the garden, and you've been sobbing and weeping for hours now. Your eyes are all puffy and everything, and you turn around, and out the corner of your eye, you glimpse someone who looks a bit like your friend who just died. What would you think? Would you think it was your friend risen from the dead? Or would you think, oh, there's a guy over there who looks a bit like my friend who's dead? I think you'd think the second one. And remember, she's not been thinking of resurrection at all. She doesn't know anything about that. So she's, of course, confused, doesn't recognize it's Jesus, and Jesus is right there in front of her. And Jesus says, why are you weeping? They're not a very understanding bunch here, are they? There's this woman lost, her best friend has died. And everybody's saying, what's the matter with you? Why are you crying? So, but for whom are you looking, says Jesus? Because the assumption would be she would be looking for him, and he's right there, but she doesn't know it. So it's a very confusing story. And then one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible, supposing him to be the gardener, in other words, thinking that he is actually the hired help. I'll talk more about thinking of Jesus as the hired help in a minute. She says, if you've taken him away, tell me, and I'll go get him here. And Jesus' reaction is to call her by name. And it's when he says her name, Mary, that she recognizes who he is. That's when she turns around and says, and John says, she said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher, which it doesn't, but never mind. Actually, the word for teacher is rabbi, right? You all know that. Rabboni means something like exalted or distinguished teacher, something like that. So, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. Jesus says to her, Mary, and it's when he calls her by name that she knows who he is. So, Jesus then says to her, in an account that we will talk about because it has a Sunday of its own, Ascension Sunday. What Jesus basically says is, I can't hang out with you right now. I've got other stuff to do. That's what he says. The other stuff happens to be the ascension, one of the most misunderstood episodes in the entire biblical narrative, because it sounds like magic and it's not. But it has its own Sunday. We'll talk about that. So she says, he says to her, I can't hang out with you right now. I have other things to do. We'll talk about those later. And so she goes and tells the guys. And the guys, of course, missed everything because they went home to watch the game. So she says, I have seen the Lord, and told them everything. This would be a great pace for the story to end now. Remember, we had the false ending of Jesus dying on the cross, which is when you'd think it would be over. But it's not, and it keeps going. And this would now be another great place to end it. Jesus is resurrected. He appears to Mary. Mary says, I have seen the Lord. End of the story. Would be perfect. But it doesn't end. The thing just keeps going. In fact, this story, it just goes on and on and on and on, this biblical narrative. It just keeps going. It's still going today. And you're in it. And it's just rolling on and on and on. And it has new characters in it as new children come along and other characters fade away. And it's quite extraordinary. The thing about the whole story is it has a pattern. And the pattern goes dying, death, resurrection, new life. It happens over and over again in the story. You just have to learn to see it. And so with the resurrection of Jesus, the story can't end because there's another chapter to come that's called New Life. And that's the part that we're in right now, the new life part of this. So, what's this new life all about? What does it look like? John's Gospel, we're just going to look at the little story I read you, not the whole Gospel. John's Gospel is full of clues about this. And some of them are really interesting, I think. First of all, the first thing you learn from the story I read you is that Christ appears to the most unlikely of people. Christ appears to Mary Magdalene. Mary, called Magdalene or Magdala, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Severely disturbed individual, very deeply troubled person. Didn't matter. Christ appeared to her. She turned around and saw Jesus. That's who God picked. Her. The other thing is that you can encounter Christ and not know. She did. She turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. You can encounter the risen Christ and not know. Maybe you already did this morning. Just not know at all. You can imagine that Christ is the hired help, supposing him to be the gardener. And what that means is, so the image here will be, say, you come to church, you lift up your prayers that day. In other words, you put your job request order before God. If God does everything in a timely fashion, according to the timetable that you've laid down, you put a couple of dollars in the offering plate to pay him off. That is treating Christ like the hired help, right? That's what the hired help does. You give them the job list, they do the job, you give them a few bucks and they go home. That's not how it's supposed to work. But even she did it. She thought that he was the gardener. The thing we learn from the story of the guys here is that you can not be present and miss the entire story, miss an encounter with Christ. When we have people join the church, which is what we did at our first service and we'll do this evening, one of the questions I ask them, and these questions are vows that people take before the assembled community and before God. In my mind, that's dead serious. If you're going to take vows before God, that matters, I think. One of the vows that we ask people to take is this. I'd say to them, will you support this church, the University Church, through your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness? The second one is presence. Because if you're not present, you miss it. That's what the story says. And not only can you miss it, but if you go, maybe someone else goes with you. Like in this story, 2 of them went home, right? 2 of them were not present there. Every time people are not present, the body is not what it could be. And then other people miss it as well. So presence is an incredibly important thing. You cannot be present and miss the whole story. The other thing is this. If you've ever done any serious reading in the biblical narrative, I put it to you, you would conclude the thing is incredibly complicated. It's people who say, oh, it's an easy book, you should sit down and read it. In my opinion, they don't really know what they're talking about. I think it's an incredibly hard book to read, and there are whole sections in it that I will tell you right now I do not understand at all. Nothing about some of the sections in it. It's a very, very hard book, particularly in some parts, to read. And so I'm completely confused about what those parts mean. And you know what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Because just like Mary, who was completely confused about what was going on in the story, she has this thing in her head that body snatchers have come in or something. And, it just won't go away, even after angels have appeared to her, Jesus appears to her, and it's just like still thinking it. You can be completely confused, and Christ appears to you. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't. That's one of the reasons that churches will often say things like, you are saved by grace, through faith. You're not saved by knowledge. You don't have to know all of the stuff in the story. You don't have to know all the stuff in the story. Christ can appear to you, maybe you already did today, and you didn't notice that it was there. But that sort of thing, you don't have to know. But, when God calls you by name, in my experience, you will definitely know when God calls you and says, come, that's it. You'll know. You'll know. That's what happens with Mary, right? It's when he says her name that she knows who it is. When Christ calls you by name, there's absolutely no mistaking it. There really isn't. So, the final thing you learn from this is when people encounter Christ like she did, what did she do? She rushed off and told a bunch of people. So, when you encounter Christ, you want to tell other people. That's what the story says. And I think that's true. If it's important enough to you, you want to share it with other people. So there's a lot to learn in this story, including the important parts, like you don't have to have it all figured out. Christ appears to the most unlikely of people. Christ can appear and you not even know it. Those sorts of things are really important. But there's a couple of really big lessons in the story that I just want to make sure that we look at just really quickly. When Jesus dies on the cross, and they take Jesus' dead body and put it inside the tomb, and then they roll a big stone in front of it. What they've really done, you see, is taken this incredibly dangerous, subversive individual, killed him, and put him inside a box made out of stone that's probably about that thick, to get him under control. Right? It's about control by the powers that be. So what they've really done is they've sort of tried to put God in a box inside the tomb with the lid on it. That's what they did. So there's Jesus, who is the living manifestation of God in the world. They kill him, put him in a box, and they think, gotcha. Now you can stop stirring everything up, going around and telling all of the really poor people that they have a right to eat, going around talking to people who are oppressed and telling them they should shake it off, all of that sort of stuff. We can't have that going on. So they kill him and they put him in. But the message of the story says this: whenever you think you've got God in a box, so you know all about, you've got God under control, God is now tamed, God is boxed up. If you open the box and look inside, guess what? It's empty. Just like the tomb. You look inside, it's empty. And where is God? God is outside in the garden talking to the most unlikely of people, like Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. You can't put God in a box. If you try and put God in a box, it won't work. If you want to encounter Christ today, look outside the box. Don't go looking in the box where everybody says, if you want to encounter God, you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, you must do... That's putting God in a box. And that doesn't work. That's what the story is about. You put God in the box, you open the box and you peek inside and God's not there. God's outside, talking to someone else. That's really important to remember that. So, Christ appears to the most unlikely of people. You know, if you were to go home and look in a mirror, maybe what you'd see, you'd think perhaps, oh, that's me. the most unlikely of people. Why would Christ ever appear to me? Because Christ appears to the most unlikely of people. That's me, and that's you. And when you look in a mirror, what you're looking to see is the very image of God in this world, which is what you were always intended to be, the image of God walking around in this world before it all went wrong and all those bad things happened. And Christ says, it's okay. I'm going to appear to you anyway. It doesn't matter all of that other stuff. Look in the mirror. See the most unlikely of people. Standing just behind you, looking over your shoulder. That's where you'll find Jesus.